Item 14 is a request for indemnification. I'll ask staff to please introduce the item.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Kendrick. This is an item at the request of Councilmember Kalasho that he be reimbursed the sum of $1,500 as indemnification for the general damages he incurred in a lawsuit that did not involve the city, although it did refer to a number of DOE defendants. But it was by Mr. Lane against Mr. Kalasho and having to do with First Amendment claims in the use of Mr. Kalasho's social media accounts. The matter is before you because normally the government code provides that when an employee, in this case a council member, is named in a lawsuit, that and if the lawsuit deals with that council or that official's official status as a public official when he's working in the course and scope of his employment or her employment with the city, that the city is obligated to provide a defense and is obligated thereafter to provide indemnification. We're here at this point to determine whether the first prong of that test is met, and that's whether Mr. Kalasho was in fact acting in the course and scope of his position as a council member as it's related to this lawsuit, and I'll get into that in a minute. The next issue would be if in fact he was, whether there were any exceptions to the general rule that his indemnification request be granted. Before we get too far along, I want to address one issue, and that has to do with the Political Reform Act. Normally, a council member would be disqualified from participating in a decision of this nature because it affects their personal finances. In this case, it meets the threshold, clearly meets the threshold of having a material financial effect on Mr. Kalasho. There is an exception to that rule, however, under the interpretation and the regulations of the adopted by the Fair Political Practices Commission, and it's considered part of the compensation of a public official and as a fringe benefit, so to speak, with that being an exception to the rule. So he can be a part of this conversation when it comes to the question, the initial threshold question of whether he was acting in the course and scope of his position as a council member. After that, Mr. Kalasho, if the council is going to discuss further the question of whether there are exceptions to the general rule and therefore should decline indemnifying him, that would be a discussion that Mr. Kalasho would be disqualified from participating in. But at the initial stage here, he's legally entitled to sit and answer questions and provide information to support his claim that this was in fact appropriate. As a little bit of background, besides giving you, I'm not going to get into everything in the report, I do want to point out that the exceptions to the question of whether he should be reimbursed for indemnification as opposed to defense costs arises because of questions of whether there was actual fraud or actual malice or corruption involved. If any of those three elements are involved, the City Council can decline to indemnify him. If there were punitive damages involved, the City Council can decline to reimburse him for those punitive damages. My understanding is there were no punitive damages paid. I can't remember if there were any alleged, but I can look at the complaint briefly in a minute to confirm that as we get along in this proceeding. The report itself provides a copy of a joint dismissal agreement signed by Mr. Kalasho in September along with Mr. Lane, and I think that concludes my report. I do know that there are some speakers before we get into the first prong of this discussion, and I'll stop from there and ask if you have any questions of me before we have speakers.
Council members, do you have any questions of the City Attorney? Angela, do we have any speaker cards?
We have 4 speakers. The first one is Mark Lane.
Hello again. Mr. Foley, to answer your question, there was no alleged punitive damage because I didn't sue him for money. I sued him for freedom of expression, so there was no money asked for. I'm going to read. When I can't say something good myself and someone else says it better, I like to use their words, so this wasn't written by me. For a fiscal conservative, Kalasho certainly wants citizens to pay a lot for his actions. The rework after his conflict of interest, his claim of poverty for a public defender, police for 2 attempted assaults and stalking, police assist now needed for process servers, Ben's day in jail, his 3 years of oversight by the probation department, and now his legal defense for this lawsuit. The biggest positive impact he could make on El Cajon budget is to move. Mr. McClellan, I'm going to borrow some of your words that you used a few minutes ago that were very applicable to this. When you give someone money, you're enabling them to do whatever they want with that money. These are my words. I didn't sue the city of El Cajon. I didn't sue the citizens of El Cajon. I sued Ben Kalasho personally. I didn't sue him in his official capacity. I sued him for violating my freedom of speech and about 100 other people that I knew of. Having the El Cajon city taxpayers pick up the bill for his personal wrongdoing is wrong. Secondly, he never denied any wrongdoing in the settlement offer that he made to us. We didn't make that settlement offer. He made it to us. 3 different versions before I finally agreed. In none of them did he deny what he did wrong. Defendants often settle lawsuits, but explicitly deny any wrongdoing. Mr. Kalasho was advised by a very experienced attorney, someone who has been in practice much longer than my attorney. But Mr. Kalasho signed the settlement without denying wrongdoing. Remember that when you talk about this. Third, Mr. Kalasho really wants to renegotiate the settlement, which it's too late to do because the judge has made it a formal court order. Mr. Kalasho is trying to get you to cover the relatively small amount of legal fees that we gave him a discount on because the legal fees were more. But this wasn't about money for me. He had to pay my attorney. If the city were to pay anything, he'd then want the city to defend him in undoing the court order. He has been harassing my attorney for days trying to get a reprieve because compliance with the order is giving his critics, persons other than me because I haven't commented once since the settlement, a chance to tell him what they think. And he doesn't like what they're writing. And before you go to conversation and say that I made that up, the words harassing my attorney came from my attorney. He asked me to include that in this talk today. As soon as you all give him a penny, he's coming after you for a pound. Don't enable him. You know his history. You know all the lawsuits he's already lost. You know they're not going to be the last. I know they're not going to be the last because we're going to be serving him and his wife with some more for some other people. You enable him on this, he's coming after you for a pound, then he's coming after you for 5 pounds, then he's coming after you for 50 pounds. Thank you.
Paul Cruz.
Mayor Pro Tem Kendrick, Mr. McClellan, Mr. Kalasho, Mr. Goebel. I'm a contributing editor for East County Magazine. I've been doing this now for almost 10 years. I am not here to support or asking you to deny the agenda item. Honestly, I'm not very comfortable at all being here when I'm supposed to be here reporting the news than becoming a part of it. I have been a professional journalist for more decades than I want to admit. I have been accredited by the San Diego City Police Department, for which I was vetted for this lanyard, which I hold. I am not a PJ bedroom blogger. I'm here reporting the truth, no matter how ugly or bad it might be, just as Saudi Arabian journalist Khashoggi did before he was murdered. Mr. Kalasho has attacked me and has attacked the publisher of East County Magazine in numerous times, the publisher being Mrs. Miriam Raftery. As it pertains to me, Mr. Kalasho began his attack on me on November 4th, 2017, when he wrote, weirdo, wannabe reporter, Paul Cruz News with East County Magazine, which now under investigation, which we're not, begging me for interviews after I've declined. Then there was another Oh no, Paul Cruz News. Please don't get a handful of your social media followers against me. No one reads your junk, weirdo. On the 9th of March, he wrote, today, a wannabe reporter which goes by the name of Paul Cruz with bankrupt news outlet East County Magazine begged me for an interview. My response, you're an idiot, keep making me famous. Then as following, comment, when I become mayor of El Cajon, drastic changes will occur on day one in City Hall. I have also been the subject of Mr. Kalasho's innuendos and direct threats, calling me a psychopath and a troll, causing people to actually go online and make death threats towards me. Just last week, although that Mrs. Kalasho has tried to hide herself as a citizen, she has injected herself as a public entity and as a public citizen, and also engaged in calling me a psychopath and a troll last week. I would very much urge the City Council to remember the actual words of Mr. Kalasho when considering the subject. Thank you very much.
Chris Leeper.
According to the report online, it says under California law, the city has the option to refuse. And one of the reasons is the employee acted or failed to act because of actual fraud, corruption, or actual malice. I don't know how many times people have to come to this podium and say that he is malicious or fraud or corrupt. This is insanity. This is insanity that he would ask for us to reimburse him for his bad behavior. And so, as far as this goes, I want to encourage you to vote no, because it would be causing the city to be an accomplice to this corruption. Thank you.
Last speaker is Jamie Freitas.
Today I was reading the agenda, which brought me here today. And obviously on item 14, it's Councilman Kalasho requesting to be reimbursed by the city for his lawsuit, Lane versus Kalasho.
Could you pull a microphone in front of you?
I'm sorry. As a council member who chooses to use a public social media that has no ties or control by the city of El Cajon is a personal choice. As a city resident, a taxpayer, the city should be held harmless against any and all claims for personal choices of all city employees. So my opinion is we should not be taking care of that cost. And apparently it's growing. So, thank you.
No more speakers, sir.
Mayor Pro Tem, there's just one thing I wanted to add to the report that was brought up by some of the speakers. Mr. Lane indicated that he sued Mr. Kalasho in his individual capacity, and in fact the complaint does state that. However, the complaint states that Mr. Kalasho violated Mr. Lane's and others' First Amendment rights under the United States Constitution. And that in and of itself lends credibility to the concept that Mr. Kalasho is being sued for his political or public official actions. You cannot have a public forum in a private individual's social media accounts. So, for example, if Mr. Mitchell had, well, I won't use you, you're a public official, but let's say Mr. Sirigliano has a social media account and he blocks somebody or deletes a comment, it doesn't create a First Amendment violation because he does not have a public forum as part of his social media accounts. So there's a distinction there that Mr. Lane's lawsuit necessarily had to state in order to prove First Amendment violations, but unfortunately it leads to the conclusion, the logical conclusion, that there's an implication he was acting as a public official as opposed to acting as a private citizen.
Angela, are there any other speaker cards?
No, sir.
Councilmember McClellan.
I'd like to ask Morgan, so it doesn't matter, we can make up our mind either way. Based upon what you said, we have the choice.
As my report indicated, there is a way you can say, even though he was a public official, that defense costs should not be paid or indemnification costs should not be paid. In this case, Mr. Kalasho is not asking for defense costs. His request is simply for indemnification, the second half of that. But in both instances, if he's a public official, the city would have to determine whether he committed actual fraud, actual malice, or corruption. And if that in fact occurred, then you could decline reimbursement. But if you can't make that finding of actual fraud, actual malice, or corruption, then you're obligated to make the payment.
Well, wouldn't calling somebody names and removing their posts and everything be kind of a malice thing?
That's for your determination.
That's my recommendation.
Yeah. The first question is whether, so Mr. Kalasho can still be a participant in this discussion. The first question is whether he was acting in his official capacity as a council member. So you need to address that first, and then you can get into the discussion while he's disqualified from discussing any of the defenses to that or the contradictions to that.
Councilmember Kalasho.
I guess I'll take this time right now to put it in plain terms for people watching. So this kind of case happened with President Trump, where he was accused of blocking somebody on Twitter, and a constituent then went on and sued him in federal court. And then because a U.S. citizen would be a constituent of President Trump, then that would mean that he was, in essence, blocking their First Amendment, the right of free speech and what have you. In this case, contrary to what a gentleman came here earlier and said that he served me papers because I was harassing a woman, I'm not sure. I don't want to make any judgments, but I don't think Mark Lane was a woman. I could be wrong. But I also want to point out a few factual inconsistencies with Mr. Lane's speaking. He said that the settlement did not mention any denial. Morgan, is the settlement in front of you?
Yes, I have.
Could you read the last line in number 1?
It's on page 1 of the settlement, the joint motion for dismissal, lines 23 and 24. Defendant denies the allegations.
Okay, so as you can see, Mark Lane is a prolific offender of the truth. But I wanted to break it down because most people don't know what this is about. And it's worth mentioning that Mark Lane is also suing the mayor of Escondido, the mayor of National City, Ron Morrison. And so, don't speak, it's not your turn. And also Mark Lane's attorney, Mr. Corey Briggs, is also the same attorney that's suing the mayor of Escondido, Sam Abed, and the mayor of National City, and me. In those two cases, the city picked up the tab on that defense, but I wasn't about to put my fate in the hands of my colleagues, so I took it upon myself to engage in that settlement because it was a business decision, because unfortunately that's the world we live in now. And it's these kind of gross practices of law that his attorney and people like him, they like to go to different cities and sue city officials and be bombastic and use bluster like you saw in other speakers speak. It's the same people over and over. And I would never be, I apologize for the fact that you guys have to sit through that, because this isn't how this practice is supposed to go down. So I took it upon myself to settle the lawsuit, which in my opinion was frivolous, for one reason. I never blocked anybody. This was on a personal Facebook page, which, as you know, is limited to 5,000 friends limit. And I exceed that all the time. And so when it exceeds that, other people can't view your stuff. This is on my personal account. So when you're sitting there thinking as a normal person, well, shoot, if somebody was calling me all sorts of names and attacking my wife or my family or all the sorts of things that you see out of them, what would you do? You'd block them first minute you get. And if you're saying you wouldn't, you're lying. So, but that didn't even happen here, right? So what I'm saying to you is, people are smarter than that. They're waking up to it. And when you see the same people over and over, when one attorney is going around suing elected officials, you're going to tell me he's not in it for the money? What's he in it for? Or you mean to tell me that after they get up to speak, they run to the UT reporter and huddle in a corner and write a crappy article that they're not all in it together? Whether I get reimbursed or not, peanuts to an elephant. It's about principle in a sense. I didn't block anybody. That's what I wanted to say, and all this other stuff. I went to jail and I did all that. These are just political attacks. Now, whether you believe them or not, that's up to you to decide. Whatever the council decides, it's up to the council to decide. But to lay it out there in context, in plain language, because the city attorney is well versed in the legal matters, these guys are not. I wanted to speak to the people watching on TV because everything's going to turn into a political circus as to why I shouldn't get reimbursed. These kinds of cases, I think Mark Lane's attorney has sued. I would be conservative if I was to tell you he's sued 50 cities or municipalities in his career. That's how he makes his living. So, yeah, it was a purely business decision. And remember this, while the mayor of Escondido and the mayor of National City got the city to pay the tab on their defense, I'm not even asking for that because the settlement's already been made. Because it would be unfair for me to ask the city, even though it's my legal right as in being in the color of office. Because, as Morgan mentioned, you as an individual cannot be sued by blocking somebody's First Amendment right. It's only until you get up here or there that you become a target. And so just think of that. Today it's me. Tomorrow it might be you. And that guy could be standing there serving you papers. So you have to be cognitive about what's really being said and what's happening. Or when you get a reporter over here that shows a badge, that every reporter gets a badge and we're not supposed to be impressed. So it isn't that I go out of my way to make a point. There's people that came up here and that spoke, Jeremiah, Jim, Frank, Ruth, Linda, Simona, Anna Marie, that have legitimate issues, but city council meetings have been overtaken. I don't want it to be the Ben Kalasho show. I want to talk about real issues. There's a reason why El Cajon has as many homeless people as La Mesa and Santee combined. It's because we get distracted by hyperbole and hyperbolic experiences that never even happened, and quite frankly, lies. So that's why I want to kind of lay out the foundation for everybody to see it in context. I never blocked anybody. I simply max out on friends on my personal Facebook page. But you can shake your head all you want, but you're going around suing people. So, and by the way, don't speak. It's not your turn. It's not your turn to speak. We listened to you. I never interrupted you, so respect the rule. So, and one thing to note, Mark Lane doesn't live in El Cajon. He's not my constituent. He lives in National City. So, just a few important facts he probably forgot to mention. Thank you.
Are there any other comments from the council members?
I think the first prong is we have to decide, did Ben act in a capacity as a public official? As much as it might pain me to do so, I believe it is. I believe his position in this case is a public official because even though it's a private account, he is a public official talking about public things. Whether you agree with his statements, whether you find them repulsive, disagreeable, it is his First Amendment right as well to speak that. And for that reason, I think it's a public forum, and I believe it's within the scope as a public official. So I believe the first prong has been met for those reasons.
So at this point, Mayor Pro Tem Kendrick, unless there are any other questions you have, if the council could take a straw vote on whether you agree with Mr. Goebel, then Mr. Kalasho. If you do, then Mr. Kalasho should step down and leave the room for the next part of the discussion.
Council members, if you believe he was acting in his official capacity, the first prong, and Steve, you believe he was?
I stated my case.
Well, but
with malice.
Yeah, we're not talking about the malice part yet, right?
Well, malice comes to play in both prongs because you could well, I'm sorry, it does not. This is part of the question of whether he's a public official. It becomes part of the initial threshold question. After that, it becomes whether you reimburse him, whether it's for legal fees or indemnification. So even if Mr. McClellan has a viewpoint of the defense or the exception for malice, it still doesn't resolve the initial question before Mr. Kalasho has to step down.
So the malice issue would be in the second phase of this?
Yes.
Okay, Bob, what he's saying is the malice issue is in the second phase.
Well,
but do you think he was acting in his official capacity?
Well, no, because it's his personal Facebook account. And since he opened it up personally, he didn't open it as a City of El Cajon Facebook page. He opened it up as a Ben Kalasho Facebook page.
Right, but my understanding is because there was the lawsuit, he was acting as a public official in that capacity.
Yes, the nature of technology has changed so quickly, and we have faced the issue with public records requests of your own individual accounts, if you'll recall, having to do with public business. And the courts have interpreted that to mean that even a private account can become a public forum, can become a source of public records. And as mentioned in the Trump case, as well as other cases throughout the United States, in Hawaii and Florida and others, there have been in Baltimore, there have been other public officials who face these similar lawsuits, even using their own personal accounts, where they use those accounts to reach out to their constituents.
So in that case, anybody that would want to put a public records request to Ben Kalasho through the City of El Cajon could get all of his Facebook records.
No, that's not correct. You could only get public records. So those are records that relate to the public's business.
So, Bob, I think your concern is the malice issue, and the malice issue comes up in the second prong. So you'll get your say on that on the second prong. But for me, I think it's pretty clear that he was acting as a public official because he was interacting with the public, whether or not they're living in El Cajon or not. He was interacting with the public. So that I would say that he was the first prong. It is met in that he was acting as a public official. And Steve, you agree on that? Bob?
Nope.
And Ben?
Well, I think you can participate at this level, and then you'll have to leave.
Yeah, and furthermore, I mean, so Bob doesn't have Facebook, so he doesn't know all of the dynamics behind it and stuff. So to clarify it, Bob, if you have a Facebook page tomorrow that's private, it is not private because you hold office. Doesn't matter how you made it.
Okay, well, it looks to me like we've got 3 votes here that say it was public.
So at this point, Mr. Kalasho, you need to be disqualified. You'll have to leave the room and state the purpose of the disqualification. It has an effect on your personal financial effects, if I think is a situation. But you need to state that.
I'm disqualifying myself because it has a financial conflict of interest.
On your personal finance.
on my personal finances. Thank you.
Okay, now we're at the stage where the council needs to determine whether you will agree to the indemnification or if you believe that there is an exception to the rule and that Mr. Kalasho should not be indemnified.
Councilmember Goebel.
Mr. Foley, can you clarify for us the definition of actual malice?
Yes, thank you. The term malice is really strictly interpreted by the courts, especially when used with public officials. Actual malice, as used in state laws, has been interpreted to mean a conscious intent to deceive, vex, annoy, or harm the injured party. So that's the standard that you would use in determining whether the malice occurred.
So, Mr. Kendrick, I would like to hear, I have a couple questions for Mr. Lane. Can we call him back up?
Morgan, can we do that? Mr. Lane, would you come up, please?
Good afternoon, Mr. Lane.
Hello.
So what I'm interested in, and the crux of this issue is, should the people of El Cajon reimburse Ben $1,500? And you sued him why did you sue him?
Can I clarify two things real quick? Number one, he stated I go around suing people. I've actually in my life never sued anybody. He's the first person I've ever sued. And secondly, the issue with the 5,000 friends has nothing to do with blocking people from being able to comment or not. If you have 5,000 friends, there's still a follow button and people can follow him. And if he makes it a public comment, people can comment. He knows that if he makes it a friends only comment, people can't. That's effectively blocking. And thirdly, he was wrong when he told Mr. McClellan that if you open a private Facebook account, it's not private. It's private until you start discussing public business. As long as you don't discuss public business, the account is still private. We don't have access to comment to you on your personal account, but the minute you talk public business, we do. Sorry for that. I just wanted to clarify that.
So let's stay in a narrow path here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware of Mr. Kalasho's comments on his side. The question to me is, did he suppress or censor your ability to make comments?
He suppressed my ability to even see his page. I couldn't see his page. And so part of the lawsuit included the screenshots. So if I tried to go to your page, I would be able to at least see your page and send you a friend request or whatever. I couldn't even see his page. I couldn't access his page at all. So yes, he did suppress my ability to do that. He also had several other people completely blocked on Twitter, on Instagram as well.
So I actually have some experience in this matter because of what I do at work. And I manage people who manage social media and Facebook. So I'm aware of the details of how Facebook works. I'm aware that you can block somebody so that they cannot see your page. I'm aware that you can still comment on somebody's page if you can see it, even though you're not a friend. You can still make a public comment. Did you ever make comments that were deleted?
Yeah, and he also practiced, and last year I talked about it several times in comment, where he would block me, then unblock me, go through and take screenshots, and then block me again. He would make a comment, I would make a comment, and then he would delete it. So yes, he did that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I'd like to call another person, if I could.
Absolutely.
Mr. Cruz, you spoke earlier, would you come to the microphone?
Yes, Mr. Goebel.
How do you feel that Mr. Well, let me ask a question for the city attorney first. Mr. City Attorney, am I allowed to consider people injured other than Mr. Lane because the settlement discusses other people?
Yeah, I think the whole issue with the complaint was to challenge to complain about a violation of Mr. Lane's First Amendment rights, but his First Amendment rights don't stop there. It's not just his that would be there. Now, the settlement agreement's only binding with Mr. Lane, nobody else. It can only be enforced by Mr. Lane if there's a breach of that agreement. But he couched the complaint in terms of the public's inability to exercise their First Amendment rights.
So am I allowed to ask Mr. Cruz a similar line of questioning?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Mr. Cruz, do you feel Mr. Kalasho suppressed or censored your ability to comment on social media?
I know he has not, to my knowledge. I have actually, by the advice of my attorneys, to only make any statements that is an approval by my attorney.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Lieber or Mr. Freitas, do either one of you want to come up and speak and answer the question? It would be similar questioning. Do you want to come up? You have nothing to add. Okay. All right. Okay. I have some comments, but I guess I'll reserve those in case others have questions.
I would like Eric to come up and explain to us what he did to her, and this was using his Facebook page.
I think there was an Instagram account as opposed to, it's social media, but it's not the Facebook page.
Hi. Yes, it was Instagram.
So that wouldn't
well,
be
social media.
Yeah.
What's the question?
What he did, what he said to you, and what?
Basically, I made one comment, which was the article that he shared wasn't very flattering for him. I said, this isn't an article to be proud of. And then he just started name-calling, kind of going back and forth. And if you look at the feed, I never insulted him. I never said anything really rude other than, you're a joke. This article doesn't really make you look good. You're my councilman. I'm embarrassed for El Cajon. I kind of made those kind of comments. And I told him he had fake followers on Instagram because he does. And then that's when he attacked my looks. He said I needed to get plastic surgery. He doesn't know how I go outside the house looking the way I do. He said I was stupid. He said I had a 5th grade education level. He said he doesn't work for me. I mean, it was long. He just kept going. It was like one comment after another. He said I didn't mother my son. I'm telling you, it was just like insult after insult.
Thank you.
Oh, ma'am, I just have one question.
Sure.
Do you feel it was malicious?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't see no point to it because I honestly wasn't that, I didn't warrant that kind of response. So I do think it was malicious and it was vindictive, and I felt like it was like 3rd grade again, like I was getting name called. I haven't been called names since 3rd grade. So I was just surprised that he was speaking to me like that.
Well, thank you for being so brave and coming up here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
very
Thank you
much.
for letting me talk. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the council?
I haven't changed my opinion.
Well, I'll give you my opinion. Boy, where do you start? This is just something else. So, what we have to figure out here is, do the people of El Cajon owe Ben $1,500?
No.
And the exception, we are required to, if he acted within the scope of his public employment, except for the exception that Mr. Foley mentioned. Actual malice, a conscious intent to deceive, vex, annoy, or harm. I don't know how anybody could say he wasn't trying to do that to Mr. Lane. That's the real issue. The real issue to me is not what is he saying, as we've heard today frankly, several of these comments, if he said those things, are repulsive.
So you agree with me then?
I think we've met the threshold of actual malice, and we should deny, the people of El Cajon should not pay Ben Kalasho $1,500.
That's a motion. I'll second it.
That is a motion.
We have a motion and second. Please vote.
I'm going to clear the panel and start again. We had an extra vote there. Please. Please vote.
No vote? Is this a no or a yes?
No, to deny it. Right,
So that's a yes.
correct.
Motion carries by a 3-0 vote with Council Member Kalasho disqualified.